Okay. I want to go over Arrick family history.
Is it recording right now?
It is recording, yeah.
I don't see any square or anything. I need some feedback.
Well, see, that moves up and down.
Gotcha.
Okay, starting over.
So, let's start with the date.
It is
July
July 2nd
2019. Let's go with that.
at 9:37 p.m. in Tyler, Texas, at the home of my dad, Roger Ray Arick, interviewed by his son, Alex Arick. So, this first one I wanted to talk about Arick family history because you are the keeper of all of the knowledge. You and Randy.
You
know
could
all
call
of
me
it.
the Oracle.
So where did the Aricks come from? And how do we know that they came from there?
Well, my dad, Leonard William Arick, spent most of his life, large part of his adult life, trying to figure out where we Aricks came from because all we knew was his father, which is Leonard L. Arick, and his grandfather, John Riley Arick, was as far back as he could go. They knew that John Riley Arick came from Tennessee, but didn't know anything beyond that. He did most of his research before online census records were available and easily searchable. So Dad died in 99, never really knowing where Aricks came from. So in about 2006 or 7, I started doing more research and got a subscription to Ancestry.com and did the census and all that stuff. And I finally figured out that we are Orricks from Warren County, Tennessee, Orrick. But they pronounced the name Ark. They pronounced Orrick as Ark, A-R-K. In fact, in some school records and other things in Tennessee, the school kids are actually listed as Ark because that's how they pronounced it. And it was more important back then how you pronounced something than how you spelled it. Which that was a lot of stuff to learn, not knowing anything about genealogy. You know, you start caring about how things are spelled and you realize, well, they didn't even care back then. They just cared how you pronounced it. So that's before John Riley Arick. His father was John Orrick, and John Orrick was shot at the Battle of Shiloh.
And did you discover that gap between them?
Well, Randy and I went to the Dallas Library one year, maybe it was around 2008 or 9, I don't remember when, but we found the military records for John Orrick, and it explained a lot of things. He was shot at Shiloh, the Battle of Shiloh, and they carried him off to Corinth when they were retreating from the incoming troops, and he died in Corinth. And we don't know his burial. He was probably buried in a shallow grave in Corinth, Mississippi. So we don't know where he's buried. And he died at the age of about 35. That was in 1862, April. So what really put this all together is I hired a lady to go dig up the military records, which included, actually not the military records, but the pension application of John Orrick's widow, which would be my third great-grandmother. And her name was Margaret Arick, or Orrick. And what happened was after her husband was shot at Shiloh and killed, leaving her with 7 kids, the youngest of which was John Riley, she remarried to a guy named William B. Nunley in Grundy County in 1867. And he fought for the Union side, and she got his pension when he died. And to get his pension, she had to produce a bunch of pension documents, and she was turned down a few times. But in those pension documents, she had to explain that she didn't know how to spell the Arick name, the Orrick name. And so she used the spelling Arick, which was sort of a combination of Orrick and Ark, like she pronounced it. So it ended up being Arrick. In the 1870 Grundy census, she's listed as Peggy Ark, and it's spelled Arke at that point. In the 1880 census, she's in Coffee County, even though she didn't move, but the county line moved. And she's there as Margaret Arick, Arrick. And Peggy is a shortcut for Margaret. So 1870 was a bad time for that part of the country, basically under martial law after the war. And the census is terrible in 1870. 1880, it's much better. And of course, the 1890 census was burned, so we don't have that. We miss a lot of details. But basically, this pension application was the mother lode for our family because it explained the name change from Orrick to Arick. And it explained a little bit about, well, explained a lot about how John Orrick died, because one of the affidavits is from a guy named Manly Wilson who fought with John Orrick. And he was in, I guess, a foxhole or whatever you call it, in a trench at the Battle of Shiloh next to John Orrick when he was shot in the chest. And he actually gives an eyewitness description of the shooting of John Orrick at the Battle of Shiloh in 1862. So, I mean, we feel really lucky having, we're one of the few families out of the 620 some odd thousand people that were killed in the Civil War to have an eyewitness account of the shooting of our, as tragic as it is, of the shooting of our third great grandfather. It changed the course of our entire family. It changed our name. It changed everything. His widow, Margaret, who married William B. Nunley, she had a child with him, but she used the Arick name forever. She didn't use the Nunley name, and we don't really know why that is. And even her daughter from William B. Nunley was named Fanny, and even Fanny went by the Arick name. She refused to use the Nunley name. I'm not sure what all that was about, but they were legitimately married, and he lived until 1889. And in typical Orrick fashion, we do not know where Margaret Orrick Nunley is buried. It's really weird. The last indication we know of her is there is a pension payment made to her in 1906, and she lives in Stick, Tennessee. And Stick, Tennessee, there used to be a post office there. There hasn't been for 100 years. And it's a little place with just a couple of houses. It's not even there on the map anymore, but I know about where it is. It's near her, where her daughter was married to a Cornelison near Manchester, Tennessee, which is in Coffee County.
So when did the Aricks move from Tennessee to Texas?
Well, John Riley Arick, who is my great-grandfather, he moved to Hardin County, Tennessee, which is sort of going west from Warren County, Tennessee after the war. And he married a Harrison girl there, Minerva Viola Harrison, in 1884. And we have a tintype picture of him. There's a long story behind the tintype, which is a great story, but the Strickland family has it, and it's now in our possession now. If I ever die, you need to go find the tintype, which is in my genealogy files, because it's the only picture of John Riley Arick.
The original. You have the original.
We have the original. And it was taken at the Kendall store. And there's some fairly new information within the last couple of years. We found out that John Riley, when he was in Coffee County as a young man, a warrant was put out for his arrest for carrying guns in public. And apparently in the cities, some of the cities, they didn't want you to carry open carry your pistols, and he did. And so a warrant was put out for his arrest, and he fled the county. I think he went to Hardin County, which is a couple
This is
counties.
John Riley.
This is John Riley, and my grandfather, your great grandfather.
You think he fled over a warrant?
And he fled over a warrant, and he went to Hardin County, and he married a Harrison girl there, and then he went immediately after that, I believe, to Kaufman County, Texas. I think he was sort of on the run, and I think the Harrison family thought that these Arrick boys, because his brother was near there too, were sort of hoodlums. And I don't think the family approved of John Riley Arrick, although we have no other evidence that he was in any way a hoodlum. When they moved to Kaufman County, Texas, he farmed there until he died in 1906. It's kind of weird because if you look at a lot of our family, a lot of people died in 1906 or plus or minus a year there. His brother did, his mom did. Mom died in 1906. And in typical Arrick fashion, John Riley Arrick's grave is to this day unfound. He was probably buried somewhere in Kaufman County. We think there's a good chance he was buried at Blackland Cemetery, and the reason for that is because we have one newspaper snippet from 1892 where it says, daughter of John Ark died and was buried at Blackland Cemetery. In fact, I think it says infant daughter of John Ark, and it's spelled A-R-K. So to me, that sounds like someone was just writing down what someone said, and they pronounced it Ark, and then they wrote down A-R-K. But there's no other Ark family. This was John Arrick. So his infant daughter died early in 1892.
The newspaper clipping said the daughter was buried there.
Yeah.
And so he would be buried close to his daughter.
We're thinking that he could be, although it was 1906 when he died, so that was...
and this newspaper clipping was from when?
1892.
Okay.
And if you look in the 1900 census, that's the first census that shows how many children that the moms had and how many were still alive. And in that census, Minerva is shown as having 5 children, and 4 of them are alive. So that corroborates the story that they had an infant that died in 1892. So there's a good chance that he's buried at Blackland Cemetery. But I've been through there. Randy's been through there a lot. It's full of poison ivy. It's right next to a road. And my thoughts are that the road actually goes over part of it because it's not parallel to the road. The road goes sort of at an angle. And my thought is John Riley is in there somewhere. But I've poked around, and I know that beyond the fence lines, I have seen markers. So there's no telling. It's a fairly unkept cemetery, but it's in Kaufman County, and if you go, you can look it up, Blackland Cemetery. Now there's 2 Blackland cemeteries. One's up in, I think, Rowlett County or near Rowlett. But this one is in Kaufman. It's just south of I-20. If you're going to Dallas and you go past Buc-ee's, if you hang a left there and go down some roads, you can run into Blackland Cemetery and you can walk it. There's a sign, and it's a well-known place.
We went there one time. I think you took me there, and we just walked outside.
Yeah.
It was very overgrown.
Yeah, it's every once in a while it gets cleaned out all the way down to the ground, and you can walk it pretty good. There's nobody else there that we know of, with the small exception of the Cash family that might have come from Tennessee. But other than that, we don't know. So we don't know where John Riley Arrick is buried. We don't know where his father is buried, probably in Corinth, Mississippi. We don't know where his mother is buried, probably in Grundy or Coffee County, Tennessee. And the generations before John Riley, the Orricks, were in Warren County, Tennessee, and they were on what I call the Orrick Farm, which is south of Centertown, Tennessee, which is in Warren County. And there's a farm there. It's 75 acres now. It used to be 125 acres. But the Orricks had their own cemetery or graveyard. And if you look at the old deeds in about 1860, there's actually a deed that talks about the graveyard being 5 poles by 5 poles, which is 80 foot by 80 foot. So it's a pretty big graveyard. I can account for maybe 20 to 50 people who are missing who could be buried in the Orrick Cemetery. And the Orrick Cemetery, it was sold and bought throughout the years. And in the 1950s, it was owned by Thomas Oliver Brewer, and there was an old cemetery on his property, the Orrick Cemetery. It was overgrown. He tried to get someone to come out and survey it for him, and that never happened, and he got old and he plowed under the entire cemetery. Part of the stories that have come down from some of the people who have researched that says there were giant rocks there that his plows ran into, and he dug these rocks up and he threw them off to the side, and that he put the tombstones or the headstones in a cistern. So if you go back there today, and I've been back there, it's now owned by Danny Hullett, and it's a 75-acre farm. There's a modern house there, and I took radar out there in 2010, and we scanned it, and sure enough found a place where the graves were that matches up where William Brewer says that the grave yard used to be.
Okay, so what kind of document did you actually find that said, with this story, that he plowed it under?
Okay, that information is from a researcher that I don't know. It's from an Orrick researcher back in maybe the 60s or the 70s, who was looking for the Orricks and ended up at the farm correctly and knocked on the door, and they said, yeah, there used to be a cemetery here, but I plowed it under. And there was a bunch of stones, and I pushed the stones off to the side and pushed them into the cistern. And so that's the story that has been handed down that I've gotten from old researchers who are long since gone. And so if you go out there now, what's interesting, you can drive around the house. And around the house, on the corners of the house, are these giant stones. They could be cornerstones to like a big building, like maybe a church. I believe there was a church there. And I believe John Riley's grandfather, Allen Orrick, Allen, I believe he ran the church. I don't have any information to prove that, but when Allen Orrick died around 1850, immediately the Big Springs Church was started up. And I think that was out of the necessity of the fact that the old church had gone, or Allen had died, or maybe the church burnt, who knows. I mean, this was 1850, so there's not a lot of documentation. In fact, 1850 is the first census where all the family members are even mentioned. But his widow, Allen Orrick's widow, which is be my third great grandparents, his widow was Martha Hardin. They came from Kentucky in the 1820s. And she lived all the way up to about 1900, so she would have been very close to 100 years old, but she didn't make the 1900 census. But in the 1860s, there is a deed that she sold a large portion of the farm to her daughter, Salethia, and that's where that deed is where the graveyard of 5 Poles Square is mentioned. So that's a pretty good piece of Orrick history right there. There was definitely a graveyard there, and it was in a deed. But that graveyard is missing now, and there's a modern house there. But the owners know me, and they know there's a graveyard there. They were there when I pulled the radar across it, and that was in 2010.
And so what did you find with the radar?
I hired a professor from the University of Knoxville to bring his radar.
You didn't exactly hire him. What happened?
Well, I got him interested in the project, and he agreed if I would make a donation to his department of $1,000, and I did gladly. And he brought the radar out. We really only spent I don't know, 4 or 5 hours out there. And what I have is pictures of the screen from his computer that show the humps. And when you drag radar, what happens is when you dig a grave, the density of the soil changes and you kind of end up with little dome shape images. And I have those. And now, of course, I don't know who these are. It could be Alan Orrick and his wife, Martha. It could be their parents, which would be Lewis Orrick and Elizabeth Meredith. And there's tons of kids and spouses that could be buried there. So there's...
Is there indication of how many graves there were?
No. The actual best preserved the best preserved graves we found were actually over the gravel road that goes to the back of the house. So maybe in a way the road kind of protected that part. But
how many people do you think could have been buried there in a range?
Again, I think it could be 20 to 50 different people. I mean, it was a community graveyard, mostly for the Orrick family, but Alan and Martha Orrick had, I don't know, 7 to 10 children.
So in this time, we're talking about the Alan Orrick's time. This is pre-Civil War. Right. And this is a small town in Tennessee with farms. Yeah. And there's a church here. What's the population of this town? What's the name of this town at this point?
Well, the general area would be called Daylight. It's kind of, if you look in the Southern Standard newspaper, there are little sections like Clearmont, and these are like little townships. They don't usually even have... This is
Coffee County?
This is Warren County.
Okay.
And it's south of Centertown. Centertown used to be called Glasscock, and George Glasscock lived there and owned a bunch of that land, and he had slaves, but the Orricks in that area didn't have slaves.
So Orricks generally did not have slaves?
No, you'd have to go all the way back to Maryland in a 1650, 1700 time to get the rich Orricks, the lawyers and the doctors and politicians. A lot of them owned slaves. In fact, some of them are documented. Some of them were released during the war, and they begged to come back because they lived in such great conditions. And so, yeah, some of those Orricks did. But the big story about the Orricks in the USA, an overview would be this. The Orricks appear in Maryland around 1650 as James O'Rourke. But he quickly starts to use the spelling Orrick, O-R-R-I-C-K.
Is this to remove any Irishness?
No, I don't really think so. I mean, I don't have any indication it's anything beyond just a simple spelling, and they don't care as much about every letter as we did. They care more about how it's spelled. But all indication, well, DNA proves that we are from O'Rourkes in Ireland. Now, that's not to say that James O'Rourke came from Ireland. He could have come from Orrick in Scotland. We don't know that yet. But around 1650, the Orricks came in. They married amongst the rich and famous, the Cromwells and the Pendletons and all these fancy people, and they were doctors and lawyers. They had a lot of money, and some of them owned property on Gibson Island. There's actually a J. Orrick Street on Gibson Island. If the old timers tell me, no, that's not Orrick, that's just a random word. No, he owned that property there, and that's where James Orrick lived. But anyway, around 1730, one of the lines of Orricks split off and went south. Only one line. And they became almost all of the Orricks of the southern United States. Just that one line that went out around 1730 to 1750. This was Daniel Boone's era. This was the King's Highway down to the Carolinas and the Indian Wars. And so there is a missing generation or two between the rich and famous Orricks in Maryland around 1730 to 50 until they start appear in the Carolinas and the Kentuckys and Tennessee around 1800. So there's a couple of generations missing there. So because of DNA, I know they're connected. I can prove they're connected, but I don't have technically a family tree. Now, there's someone online who has said, oh, we have an Orrick Bible, and it explains the gap, and the gap is filled up with a couple of Matthew Orricks. But this happened about 5 years before I got into genealogy on the internet, and I have spent 10 years trying to locate this Bible, and no one can find it, and they can't find the person who posted it. And the person who posted it, their email is an address to a virus.
Oh my gosh.
So it's some sort of, I believe it's probably true, but I'd kind of like to see this Bible and get it in my hand, but it explains the Orrick gap. And it's pretty detailed. It gives 2, 3, 4 generations of various people.
So you've seen scans?
Yes, I have a text, and it's on my website, and you can look it up. Now, some people on Ancestry have taken that for the gospel, and they've put it on there. So if you look on Ancestry and you look on public trees, you'll find these Orricks, and you'll see, oh, well, it's fully connected all the way back to the Maryland Orricks. But on my tree, you will not find that, because I stop at Lewis Orrick, who was born 1770 in South Carolina. I stop with him because I don't know for sure that his father is Matthew, because I don't find this Bible. But I'm hoping someday to wake up to an email to someone who says, yeah, my great-grandfather died and he left this bookshelf full of stuff, and I looked this one up and I think this ought to go to you, and it proves the whole thing. But until that happens, I'm not inclined to fill out my tree like a lot of other people have.
How much focus have you, if you had given more focus to the Maryland part of the country, do you think you'd find this missing link somewhere?
No, because this small branch peeled off from the well-documented, well-connected, wealthy Orricks in Maryland. This one branch peeled off and went south and separated themselves. They became rather poor dirt farmers in the South, and they spent the other next 100 years being farmers. And when I first got into it, I had the suspicion that we were connected to the Orricks, but the old-timey researchers told me, no, that can't be true. The old Orricks in Maryland, they're rich and famous, and we Orricks in the South, we're just poor dirt farmers with no teeth. But I thought they were the same people. And so when DNA testing came out, I was one of the early adopters, and I guess it was about 2007 or so. I set up a DNA study with Family Tree DNA, and I got DNA from about 15 different people. And one of them was from a well-known Orrick from the Maryland line, who's well documented to the Maryland line. And he matches the Southern Orricks and us Aricks, of course. So, I mean, that proves that we are indeed connected. And I think I want a steak dinner over that from one of the older. But,
So there's another, I read that, I Googled the Arick name when I was a kid, and it said it was related to a French name, which was Arrick. So there are other Aricks in the United States that are not related to us, but it's spelled the same.
Okay. As far as, to my knowledge, no. I've not found a single, with DNA study or traditional documentation, I haven't found any other Aricks or Orrick spelling that aren't obviously related to us Aricks. Now, there's some of us Aricks that are from this one branch that got misspelled to Arick in 1862 through Margaret's line. Some of them use one R, A-R-I-C-K. And one of them does appear in Arkansas. This is William Frank Arick, A-R-I-C-K. And no one has ever known where he came from. But I found one of his descendants, Donald Arick, A-R-I-C-K. You can find them in Arkansas. And his DNA matches us very close. So I'm convinced he's one of Margaret's sons. And he spelled his name A-R-I-C-K with just one R. But again, he is just part of our very small branch that got their name misspelled at the Civil War. The rest of the Orricks are are spelled Orrick, and there is a branch in Tennessee that's Orick, one R. So there's quite a few Orricks with one R that are connected to us Orricks.
And Arcs. Are Arcs still around?
I haven't found a solid connection to a family named Ark, and there are some families named Ark, A-R-K, or spelled Ark. I haven't found that their DNA matches, but we're early in the DNA revolution, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if some Orricks or some Arks show up in various spellings that are really Orricks. Because in Tennessee, when they moved south, a lot of those Tennesseans and Kentuckians and Alabamans and others, they pronounced the Orrick name, they pronounced it Ark. And so it got spelled Ark in a lot of cases, A-R-K.
So when I was driving through San Francisco one time, I noticed the Orrick Law Firm.
Mm-hmm.
Are they related to us?
Absolutely. You can trace those Orricks all the way back through famous lawyers who go all the way back to Supreme Court justices, and they go directly to the Maryland Orricks.
Do we have a Supreme Court justice relative?
William Horsley Orrick, I believe, worked for John F. Kennedy, and he was part of the Patty Hearst trial, and they're mostly Democrats and have leaned left. How the migration works on some of those Orricks is they moved across the northern part of the United States. From Maryland, they went through Mississippi Missouri, and they were politicians and lawyers and business owners in Missouri, and then they continued on to San Francisco. One of them was a paint manufacturer in San Francisco, and their lines are well documented, their families are well off, and their names are well known. This is different than the Southern Orricks, because the Southern Orricks peeled off, and in a time where there wasn't good documentation, like in the mid and late 1700s, and a lot of those courthouses were burned in the war, and their family histories, a lot of them didn't survive very well. So the Northern Orricks are fairly well documented, and the Southern Orricks are not. A lot of the documentation for the Northern Orricks comes from a book written by Stella Pickett Hardy, who, the name of the book is, I believe it's Families of the Southern United States, Southern Colonial Families, something like that, I forget, but it's a well-known book, you can find it. And she went to these Orricks and she asked them, "Where'd you come from?" And they said, "Well, we came from Scotland. We came from a place called Orrock, O-R-R-O-C-K, Scotland." And indeed, there's a place north of the Bay of Edinburgh in Scotland where there's a place called Orrock, and there's Orrock families there. But I have yet to get an Orrock participant in the DNA study, and I can't prove that they are O'Rourkes from Ireland. So I don't know the answer to that. I can't prove Stella Pickett Hardy's history that she got from Orricks in Maryland. It wouldn't surprise me if it was true, but what I know for sure is true is that our Orricks in the United States match DNA to O'Rourkes in Ireland. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't go from Ireland over to Scotland for a few hundred years and then come to the United States from there. That's certainly possible. So her story could be true. It could be O'Rourkes and O'Rourkes in Ireland.
So are we descendants of Tiernan O'Rourke?
The answer to that is yes. I don't know exactly how. It goes back at least 1,000 years. And this is, of course, in the northern central part of Ireland. And I don't know a lot about that history.
Was it his wife was kidnapped or something? There's some history.
Yeah, this is not history that I'm well acquainted with, but This is history that that many smart people have documented, and it's part of Ireland history. And the O'Rourkes are, an important family. They were rulers and despots, and so there's quite a bit of history there. It's a little bit outside my range. I've sort of focused on the American Orricks and trying to figure out, mainly this big gap between the Maryland Orricks and the Southern Orricks is probably my main interest. I'd like to fill that gap, because if we did, it would connect about 350, 400 years of Orrick history. But I've never gone beyond the Maryland Orricks of 1650. I've never gone backwards to find out where did they come from. Where actually did James come from? Is there a document in Scotland or Ireland that explains why he left, or somehow he's connected with these rich families, the Cromwells and the others, so they might have escaped. There's a lot of history there that I don't know about. There's a lot of political upheaval in that area around that time.
Okay. Testing. Good. Okay, let's start with me and then go backwards.
Okay. So you're Alex Arick, and your brother is Alan Arick, and y'all are the sons of Roger Ray Arick, born 1961, still alive in 2019, and Margaret Lynn Mosh, who was born in 64, still alive. So we're going to go on the Arick line, and we're going to go backwards. So Roger Arick's father is Leonard William Arick. He was born in 1930 in Abilene, Texas. And Leonard was one boy, and he had 4 sisters, one of which died young. They lived at the brick plant, and his father was Leonard L. Arick. Now, we don't know what the L stood for, but I have a theory that the L stood for Lewis. And the only reason I think that is because my 4th great-grandfather is Lewis, and there's no other reason than that. And there's no other Leonards in our family besides these 2, and the only thing I can think of that might explain why is that Leonard L. Arick was born in Kaufman County, Texas, and nearby was a city named Leonard, Texas. It's up in Fannin County, actually, but some of the Orricks went through there and lived up there. And so that's the only thing I can think of, is that was a local word that people used, and Leonard L. Arick was born in 1890 in Kaufman County, and he was named Leonard by John Riley Arick, his father. John Riley Arick was born, his father, to John Orrick, and John Orrick was shot at the Battle of Shiloh, and later died within a month in Corinth, Mississippi. His mom was, John Riley's Arick's mom was Margaret Qualls. Her last name was Qualls, and I believe her father was Canon Qualls. And that's a big deal for me to figure out that Canon Qualls is my 4th great-grandfather. But anyway, that's another story. But when John Orrick was shot at Shiloh, Margaret, I believe there's a chance that Margaret was then pregnant with John Riley Arick. So I don't know that John Orrick ever saw John Riley Arick. And because we don't know the exact birth date of John Riley Arick, it's not really very plain in the census. Even though he's listed in the 1900 census, I can't really read what his birth date is. I think it's 1862, and that's the year John Orrick was shot. So my theory about how names work is that when a son is named the same name as the father, then they need a way to distinguish between the two. So I think his father went by the name John Orrick, but I think John Riley Arick went by the name Johnny. And the reason for that is because in several different places his name is written as Johnny, and some of his children have death certificates that say Johnny, and so I think people actually refer to him as Johnny because the word John meant his father, who was shot at Shiloh. So when Margaret Qualls Orrick was widowed by the shooting of John Orrick, she had several kids and probably pregnant with John Riley. And those kids, a lot of them were girls. One of them, we'll start with the oldest one, James C. Arick, or Orrick. He moved to Hardin County and he married Mary Frances Beckham. And later, John Riley actually moved out near Hardin County with him, and he married Minerva Viola Harrison, and then later moved to Kaufman County, Tennessee. The other kids of Margaret Qualls Orrick and John Orrick were Sarah Elizabeth Orrick, and she married first Raleigh Crownover, who died in the 1890s, and then married James B. Anderson, but she never had any kids. So that line is sort of petered out. The next one would have been Laura Orrick, and she married Pete Cornelison. So there's a Cornelison family there that is related to us, but again, that line, the Orrick and Arick name didn't go through. The another one is this William Frank Orrick, who I believed ends up in Pulaski County, Arkansas, and he uses the spelling Arick, and he's listed as William Frank Arick, and I've got the DNA of some of his descendants, and he's a really good match. So I think that is a really close line from our Aricks. And again, the Arick spelling variation from Orrick is because they pronounced it Ark, and Margaret didn't know really how to spell it, so she kind of went with Arrick. She kind of got it right. She got the Orrick part, but she ended up with an A on the front of it. So that's been a big mystery in our family. But we know from her pension applications, that's the story there. So there's a couple other kids we don't really know where they go. Possibly another Margaret that could have been married and be hard to find, could have died early. So there's a couple of lines that we're not 100% sure that could be connected with us, but we don't know yet. So before John Orrick, who was the father of John Riley Orrick, his father was Allen Orrick, Allen. Now you might think, oh, Roger named his son Allen Orrick after his third great grandfather, but no, that's not the case. I did not know all of this stuff. Nobody in our family knew about Allen Orrick before about 2007 or 8. And it just so happens that I named my first son Allen Arick, the same spelling as my third great grandfather, which is an amazing thing to happen to me.
Who was I named after?
You were, we were searching for a name, and I like Alex Van Halen, the drummer, and we didn't know anyone else with the name Alex, so it didn't have any sort of baggage that went along with it, so we named you Alex. So I remember it sort of being a struggle of what are we going to name Alex? And it was just, that's the name we came up with. There's also a street in Colleyville, I believe it's
called
Allendale, wasn't it?
Yep.
And that's where we got your middle name.
So my middle name came from a street sign.
Yeah. But we really didn't know anybody named Dell, or not enough people, I guess, and we didn't feel like it was connected to anything. We just wanted to pick something disconnected that was just for your own person.
Yeah.
So what I know about Alan Orrick is that he was born somewhere around 1800 in Kentucky, and he married and he came to Warren County, Tennessee, and they were apple farmers from what I can tell. And I actually found a book about apples, and there is actually an Orrick Apple that comes, I believe, from Kentucky. I called the guy who wrote the book. He was about 90-something years old at the time, and he said, no, there was no other information beyond that there was a variety of apple called the Orricks, the Orrick Apple. And when they went to Warren County, Tennessee, they were apple farmers, but a lot of people were apple farmers in Warren County, Tennessee. I heard that apple brandy was a common product in that area. And
this is Johnny Appleseed days.
I guess so. So Alan Orrick died kind of young. He died, he made the 1850 census, but he died soon after that. There's a plat record that shows his widow listed in 1853. So he died between 1850 and 1853. And he had a lot of kids, and he wasn't very old. He was late 40s or maybe 50. And he had a lot of kids, 7, 8, 10 kids, and some of them died young. The oldest kid is Jeremiah Orrick, and he went by the all those kids went by the Orrick name. They didn't go by the Arick name. The Arick name is a misspelling that happened at the Civil War with Margaret misspelling her name. So Alan's father is Lewis Orrick.
Okay, let's pause for a second.
So Alan's father is Lewis Orrick, and he was born in 1770, probably in South Carolina, maybe Charleston area. And this is the area where we don't have hardly any information, but if you look in Hardin County, Kentucky, not Hardin County, Tennessee, but Kentucky, you'll see some marriage records, one for Lewis Orrick, which I think is his second marriage, to Elizabeth Meredith, and also Alan Orrick, his son, got married to Martha Hardin in 1819. They're listed there. So other than that, there's not a lot of information about the Orricks in Kentucky, except that in the census they're misspelled as Jorrick with the letter Y. Yorrick, some sort of weird spelling like that. But that's Alan and Lewis Orrick. They're our guys. It's just a misspelling. The Orricks in Kentucky were also married into the Skaggs family and the Duncan family, but I haven't followed those lines very well. The Skaggs family is well researched, and some of those people are from they're Orricks. They're an Orrick female who married into the Skaggs line, had a bunch of kids. Maroon is another family that migrated from Kentucky. There was a lot of land problems in Kentucky where people owned land, and then the government came in and threw out all the deeds, and they said the land transactions were illegitimate. So a lot of people were in chaos then and moved around that time. This was around 1820, 1825. Also, that was in that year, there was about, I think it was 1816 or 17 was the year without a summer, where there was a volcano on the other side of the world, Tambora or something, that went off, and it changed the climate of the world. And it snowed in the summer, and it ruined crops and all sorts of things. And our Alan Orrick and Lewis Orrick, they went through that, and that's near the time that they picked up and they moved from Kentucky and went to Warren County, Tennessee. You can read about that on Wikipedia and all the places. It's the year without a summer. Wow. And it's pretty fascinating.
And so it stops at Lewis.
It stops at Lewis. That's the gap that goes from Lewis back to the Maryland Orricks. That's the gap I'm talking about, which is at least I would say it's between 1 and 4 generations. Might be 2 generations, I don't know. And that gap is filled in with one document from one person that I cannot corroborate with. And it has a couple of Matthews in there, Matthew Orrick and his father, Matthew Orrick. And then it connects to the Maryland Orricks. And that document could certainly be true, and I wish it would be, and I wish I could know that it was true, because it would connect us all the way back to 1650 pretty solidly. But I cannot find that document. And I've written that document, I've typed it out, it's on my website, you can see it. And you can just look for Matthew Orrick, and it's in there. It shows his wives and his kids and all sorts of things, but I cannot corroborate any of it, and everywhere I look is a dead end.
So let's go back down to the rifle story.
Okay.
As I was growing up, I would always see this rifle mounted above the fireplace at Mama's house, Mama and Papa's house. And then it was almost treated like a sacred object after Papa died, and that's probably when I was old enough to notice it and notice that it was significant. And what is the story behind the rifle? What did your dad tell you about the rifle?
The story was my dad speculating that, first of all, we know for sure this was Leonard L rifle. And Leonard L is my father's father, who was born in 1890 in Kaufman County. The story is that that rifle was given to him by his father, John Riley Arick, around his 14th birthday. And that kind of jives because John Riley Arick lived until 1906, which would have been Leonard L. Arick's 16th year. So John Riley Arick was indeed alive at his 14th birthday. So the story or the speculation is that they went hunting and they got separated, and a shot was fired and accidentally hit John Riley Arick. But he lived, and he went back home, and maybe he died of an infection. Or maybe that's just a story that is unrelated to John Riley Arick's death. And John Riley Arick was born around 1862, so he really didn't live that long. If he died in 1906, he'd, 40s or 50s. So something happened to him, but a lot of people got sick in our family in 1906 and died. I mean, I can probably list 10 people in the Orrick family who died around 1906, 1907, and I don't know why. It might just be a fluke, but it's weird. Many Orricks and Aricks died in 1906, and I'd like to figure out if there was some connection there. But anyway, that rifle, my understanding is that it was shot only once, and it was handed down from Leonard L. I'm not sure how it got into my father's hands, but maybe through his mother. And it was always hanging above the mantle in our house in North Richland Hills. And that would be the house of Leonard William Arick, who was born in 1930. That was his house. Since 1964, that house was built in 64. That's when we moved in after we came back from Alaska after the earthquake in 64. And
who has the rifle now? You or Randy?
Randy has the rifle. I built him a case for it, and he has it. And it's not an expensive rifle. It was like bought at Sears or something, or it's just a hardware store rifle. I don't remember the type. I've got pictures of it probably on the website. I mentioned this story to one of Leonard L's line, who is Claude, some of their descendants, who would be my, second or third cousins, and they thought that story was preposterous. But I've discovered that a lot of these stories, especially the stories about bad things that happens, like illnesses or accidents or alcoholism or whatever, these stories, they somehow get through, but half of the family denies that they're real and they're just completely made up, and the other half admits that, yeah, they're true, I'm sorry. And in every case that I've researched, these stories that are unflattering are mostly true. They're not just made up out of nothing. They come there, I would say, every one that I found is 80% or more true. But back then, it's really weird. Today, when bad things happen to our family, we write blogs and we take pictures and we post it on the internet. We flaunt the bad things. It's almost like we praise victimhood. But back then, when a bad thing happened, when a family member was disabled or there was an accident or death, people hid that information. They didn't want to say it. And so a lot of the mysteries are just simply bad things that happens. Sometimes it's just something like alcoholism or a train wreck or I've even found people, there's one Orrick family that actually died from a train wreck. And I think this was in Kentucky in the probably early 1900s. And, the family doesn't want to talk about it. And it's like they want to keep it a secret or something.
Even though there's all this time.
It's like, why would you want to deny that sort of history? But the thinking back then, I think, was that if there was a bad thing that happened, it sort of revealed a vulnerability, and you didn't want to tell other members of your tribe about this imperfection in your family. Now we just blather our imperfections everywhere, and we somehow get comfort from telling other people about our misfortunes. But back then, it was exactly the opposite. People fought it tooth and nail whenever bad things, like after the war, there was a lot of infidelity. Women kept having babies from neighbor boys, and their families large families from these lines, but people won't talk about where it came from. But you can find out. But it was denied by so many family members because it made the family look bad if there was these sort of imperfections in the family. There is a whole line of Orricks that come from Nancy Orrick. Nancy was a daughter of Alan Orrick, and she never married, but she had children, and she named those children with the last name Orrick. But those children were fathered by a neighbor named John Raines. And her children were very successful. One was a minister. They all had large families. Her son was an Orrick, and there's a long line of Orricks that are out there that are related to Nancy Orrick, but their Y chromosome DNA do not match Orrick's because they are Raines. They have Raines Y chromosome, and they come from Nancy Orrick. And this was denied. If you go to Warren County, Tennessee, and you find some old timers, you'll say, well, that's just an old made-up story. And no, it's absolutely true, because I've got DNA to prove it, because I found one of those lines of Orricks, modern Orricks, and did the DNA testing, and they test as Raines. The other daughter that she had married a Wood, and they had a large family and very successful family with all kinds of successful people. So there's nothing to be ashamed about those two kids that were born out of wedlock, because those families turned out to be very successful and prolific.
It's Raines, E-S?
R-A-I-N-S is how it was spelled in that era at that time. But there are a lot of Raines, and there's a lot of spellings. There's even a Raines County here in Texas. There's a Marthasville in Louisiana, and all those are Raines from the Warren County area.
Okay, so bragging rights of the family. We have a lot of random things. We have apples. We've covered apples are named after us. There's a law firm in San Francisco that's very big. Mm-hmm. I drove through Orrick, California.
Okay, the Orrick, California thing, first of all, it's spelled O-R-I-C-K.
Right.
Now, there are plenty of Orricks that are related to us that use only the one R spelling. They're mostly in northeast Tennessee, in Hancock and Granger County, Hawkins County. Those are O-R-I-C-K Orricks, but they're our cousins. They came from the southern Orricks that split out of Maryland. But everyone I've talked to in Orrick, California, which is in Humboldt County, I hear it's a big pot producer now.
In California.
Yeah. Or is it California or Oregon?
It's Orrick, California.
Okay.
But I drove there on my way north.
Okay. Well, it's a real beautiful area. I've never been there.
It's on the coast. If you're driving from San Francisco to Crescent City,
right.
You go through Orrick.
Yeah. And it's a logging community, or was. But I've been told that
what
it
I
has...
noticed there, it was farms.
Okay. I've been told that that name has nothing to do with anything. It's not named after a person. It's some old Indian name. But I'm suspicious that it is, and I'm going to keep looking. And the reason is I keep finding this Orick denial syndrome where you go to this, like on Gibson Island in Maryland, I found the place where James Orick had land, and sure enough, there is a road right across the middle of the island named J. Orick. And I'm going, oh my gosh, this exactly makes sense. But I talked to the researcher who researches that island, and he says, no, that was just a word they picked up. We don't really know where it came from. And it's just a random name they put on there. No, it's not. It's exactly James Orick's land. And I mean, I could probably go find deeds and prove that. It goes way back to, we're talking early 1700s, where this, late 1600s, where this land comes from.
Okay. The other thing that comes to mind that you've told me before is the story of Dump.
Okay. Well,
Dump. I love telling people about my family. I said, yeah, I have a relative named Dump.
I don't have Dump's DNA, but there is a fairly large family from Dump Cummings Orick, O-R-I-C-K, and he's from the Northeast Tennessee Orricks, and which we know those Orricks are related to
the
us.
ones we just talked about.
Yeah, well, they're related to the Middle Tennessee Orricks, and they go all the way back. Their DNA matches the Orricks in Maryland, just like mine does. But this Cummings Dump Orick had a big family, and I've heard a couple of things about him. I don't know if it's true, but I've heard it from other researchers. One of them is that the Orricks were driving their buggy along a road, and they found a kid that was dumped off the side of the road, and they picked him up and adopted him, and they called him Dump because he was dumped off the side of the road. And now other people say, no, his name was Dumfries. That was a real name, and that Dump was shortcut. And I have found another person who says that Dump had maybe 2 or 3 complete families around the country, that he would travel to various areas, and he had complete families with large batches of children that he was the father of, and that there are Orricks from his line, many, from several families. I don't know if that's true or not either, but there are other people who research it, and one of these days I might get interested enough to dig up and find out about Dump.
Are those other families named Orick?
Yeah, to my knowledge, they are. O-R-I-C-K is the spelling there.
And so Beto O'Rourke,
okay,
the presidential candidate, which line is he from? Because his spelling goes way back to the Irish.
Yeah.
So is he a later immigrant?
Probably. I would guess that he doesn't come from the Maryland line like we did. He probably came much later. And I haven't researched his line. It's probably online somewhere, and you can find out where he came from. But if he's really an O'Rourke, then his Y chromosome matches us, and he's a distant cousin. He might be a 15th cousin or something like that.
Okay.
He has sort of the sensibilities of the East Coast Orricks, who were the rich and famous politicians from Maryland, who didn't go south. They went across the north to the West Coast, and became the Orrick law firm. And they married into rich families, the Dorseys and Pendletons and Cromwells and all these.
The question of Native American heritage in our family. Now, if you look just at the facial features of someone like Randy, you can see there's something there. It's not red-blooded, red cheeks. It's not like pure white European, untouched by anything else. So what the story about Minerva? So what is the relationship of Minerva and...
Well, we have a picture of Minerva, which is my great-grandmother. She was married to John Riley Arrick in 1884 in Hardin County. And there is a tintype of her. That's the one that I have in my stash there. It's a family heirloom, so make sure to capture it. It's a tintype given by the Strickland family. Our cousin Ron Strickland gave it to us. And that shows John Riley Arrick and Minerva Viola Harrison at their wedding date, I believe, in 1884. And her, if you look at her, she has, she sort of looks Indian. She's got bangs and the whole thing. So, I don't really know. We don't know her mother exactly. Her mother is Susan Smith. And some people say, well, Susan Smith was an Indian. But other people have said, no, Susan Smith comes from a well-known Smith family. But that line is not figured out yet. And Ron Strickland, our cousin, is working on that Smith line, who is Susan Smith, who would be my fourth great-grandparent, your fifth great-grandparents. I think that's how far. No, let's see. Minerva is my great-grandmother. So Susan Smith would be my second great-grandmother.
Yeah.
And her husband was James A. Harrison. That's my second great-grandparents. They're your third great-grandparents.
Did Papa see the tintype?
He didn't see it in person. He saw a scan of it. When the internet first came out, he got web TV. And after all this research of years and Randy going to libraries every Sunday for 10 years, Dad gets a web TV, and the first inquiry he puts out is on a forum somewhere that says, I'm looking for John Riley Arrick. And the first thing he gets back is a picture of the tintype. And it blows open the doors. We've never had anything like that. And it comes from the Strickland family. It comes from Ron Strickland. And it was kind of a funny situation. Now, I've looked through the archives of internet history in the 90s, and I cannot for the life of me find the posting that Dad made. But I would love to find that posting. It's got to be on one of the Roots web.
But he printed everything. So he used to print emails that I would send him. Hi, Grandpa, here's a website I made.
I haven't seen it in any of his... I don't have all of his documents. But it might be in something Randy has. Might be in a box somewhere. There's a lot of boxes of various stuff. I have some of his documents, but I've never seen an email from Ron Strickland that is the... I'd like to know what forum it was on. But there's some old genealogy forums like GenWeb or RootsWeb. I forget what it was called back in the 90s. I wasn't even involved in it back then. But Dad got on it, and Ron Strickland was on there, our cousin who now lives in Florida. And pow, they got that tintype. So later in 2000, I don't know, 12...
So how did Ron... Hold that thought. Where did Ron Strickland get the tintype?
Okay, the reason Ron Strickland has that is because Minerva's sister, Caledonia, married a Strickland. And so Caledonia had this tintype of her sister getting married. And it got through the Strickland line and was preserved through the Strickland line. But they knew it was... They knew it was John Riley Arrick and Minerva.
And so was it written on it?
Yes, on the back of it is scratched on it, and that was never looked at until I got it. And I believe the scratching says John Arrick on it. And you can look at that on my website. I have a pretty good scan of the back of it, and I believe it also describes the Kindle store. And I believe there was a traveling photography studio that went around, and it went to the local grocery store. People showed up, got their picture taken, and made tintypes, and they scratched on the back of it, John Arrick, and gave it to them. And so a few years ago, when I met Ron in Hardin County, Tennessee, for our annual genealogy meetup, he gave me, our family, the Arrick family, the tintype. And so we are in possession of it. He thought it was best kept with us, since it was his family too, because it's a Harrison, but he thought it was better to be with us. So I'm in possession of that. So Randy has most of the heirlooms, but I have that one. Randy has the gun. Randy has the oval picture of Minerva.
There's another photo of Minerva.
A big picture of Minerva.
Oh, okay. I don't know if I've seen that one.
Yeah, and it was hanging in our house for a long time.
Maybe I have. I just don't remember.
Yeah.
Let's look at Papa. Or no, hold on. Isn't there a story about a murder? Isn't there a weird, bizarre story that every time you tell me it, it's my jaw drops with genealogy? There's some mystery. The guy who hid his identity and left. This guy. You know who I'm talking about? And then he had a deathbed confession, apparently.
Are you talking about the outlaw Orricks up in Missouri?
I think so.
Okay, well, there is a splinter of the Orrick, of the Southern Orricks, who ended up back in Missouri. Now, these aren't the rich and famous Orricks that went across. These are some of the Southern toothless Orricks that went up from the south, and one of them was named Lewis Orrick, and I believe he is a brother of Alan Orrick.
A brother or a cousin?
A brother. In other words, the son of Lewis Orrick. So there's a Lewis and a Lewis.
Oh.
Okay. And this Lewis Orrick lived in Missouri, Iron County, and had a bunch of kids. And he was a minister. And a couple of his kids, one of them named Lewis, so there's 3 Lewises in a line, and one of them named John Henry, became outlaws. And this was around the time of Jesse James, and this was right after the war. You got to remember the South was like under martial law. I mean, it was like a nuclear war.
It was like Reconstruction.
Yeah, it was Reconstruction. It was terrible. It was farms were burnt, courthouses were burned. Society was starting from scratch in a lot of cases. And so Lewis and Henry Orick were outlaws, and they ended up involved in a murder of someone where there was a lover involved.
Oh, so he killed the neighbor or something?
Yeah. And I forget his name, but I have written that on my website, and you can research that. It's been a while since I've researched that. But eventually, a posse was sent out, and Lewis Orick was shot in a bale of hay and killed. The young son Lewis.
By vigilantes?
No, by a posse.
It was like the town?
It might have been some guys that they hired that said, we'll give you a reward if you can go find these hoodlums who were terrorizing the town. And so Lewis was killed, but Henry got away, and they finally caught Henry. I've heard that he was dressed as a woman walking around town, disguised as a woman, but they caught him and they put him in jail, and they sentenced him to hanging. And through some bizarre thing, the whole jail was let loose the night before his hanging, or soon before his hanging. And he was never seen again. A few years ago, I was contacted by a guy who says that he has a story from his father or his grandfather that on his deathbed, he admitted to being Henry Orick, who had changed his name. He escaped and went incognito because he was sentenced to hanging for murder. But I have never been able to confirm that, and it's one of those things that could probably use a lifetime of research, but it'd be interesting. There might be a whole line of Orricks out there that match our DNA but don't have the Orick name because he went off and had kids from another. I mean, I don't know this, but it's certainly possible. But I think that story could be found out if you could find those descendants who claim that story. Just if you can find a male DNA, you can trace the Y chromosome back.
This guy, have you talked to him?
It's been many years. This is 2019. I started this in 2007. So in the first 2 years, I spent about 1,000 hours a year. So I got a couple thousand hours to kind of unwind this whole thing. And then I sort of tapered off and went back to work. But in that time, I ran across all these various stories. So throughout the years, I come across other stories that, and some of them I run down and some of them I don't. There's also a story of one of the Northern Orricks who actually moved to, I think it was Alabama or Mississippi around the time of the war. These were the John Cromwell Orrick. And he was like a dentist or something, typical Orrick, rich Orrick, who was a doctor or dentist lawyer. And he had a son, John Cromwell Jr. And John Cromwell Jr. was, he shot a black man in town. And he fled the town. And he changed his name to his mom's last name, which was Arrington. He changed his name to George Washington Arrington, but his real name is John Cromwell Jr. And he went to South America for a while, and then after the war he came back, and he became a famous Texas Ranger. And he was, I understand he was part of the team that went through West Texas to clean out West Texas so that settlers could go there without being killed by Indians. And I heard he was kind of ruthless, and he was one of the Texas Rangers who did some of that difficult to repeat work. He ended up in the Panhandle, and he has a house out there, and his house, my understanding, is the Arrington Ranch, which was used in the film by Tom Hanks called Castaway. And in that film, Tom Hanks is a FedEx driver or UPS driver, whatever it is, and he delivers a box to a lady who lives in a farm there, and that farm is the Arrington Ranch. And so the Arrington, his name is really John Cromwell Orrick. He's an Orrick, and all of his descendants are Arringtons, but their DNA matches us Orricks. They're our cousins.
And they're aware of this story?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Arrington Ranch can be toured, or I think it's a bed and breakfast.
Have you been out there?
No, I haven't been to the Panhandle.
So when we went out to Abilene in 2012, we went to a couple small towns and found some graves on a mountain.
Yeah.
On Double Mountain out there. It's like a little hill.
Yeah.
What were those?
Those were, their last name is Orrick, O-R-I-C-K. But they're from Middle Tennessee. They're from our branch of Orricks. They came from around Warren County, Tennessee, and they just kind of went a different route to go through Texas. They went across the north of Texas, and their father died in Fannin County, Texas, and he's one of those ones that died in 1906, and his name is Jerry Elmore Orrick, O-R-I-C-K. He died in 1906. I don't know why so many Orricks and Aricks died in 1906. But his kids moved out west, and they're north of Abilene. And I just kind of wanted to see them. I don't really, there's not a lot of Orricks from that line, but it's kind of interesting to go out there and see an Orrick and say, yeah, they're my fourth or fifth cousin. They're probably my fifth cousin. But they are descendants. They share a common ancestor, probably Alan Orrick, with all of us. They come from Alan Orrick's line. So Alan died young, but he had quite a few kids, and his wife, Martha Hardin Orrick, lived really like 50 years after Alan died. Can you imagine living 50 years after your spouse died? They already had all their kids. I mean, she was probably 50 years old when he died, and then she lived another 50 years as a widow. But she's not in the 1900 census, so she died right before then.
In her 90s.
Late 90s, because I have some records of her property, and she's still the taxpayer on a few acres, even I think in 1998. So she lived to 99 or 1899 or maybe even 1900. She just didn't make the census. There's a slight possibility that she's somehow in the 1900 census under, maybe she got married at the age of 99 or something and she's under a different name, but I've never been able to find that. I think she died. And I think she's buried at the Orrick Cemetery plowed under by Thomas Oliver Brewer in the 1950s. I think she's right there. So she would be there. Her husband, Alan Orrick, would be there. Some of their kids would be there. Alan's father, Lewis, would be there. A lot of people would be there in the Orrick Cemetery. It was 80 foot by 80 foot, so there could literally be, I don't think there's just 5 people there. I think there's 20, 30, 40 people there. And the house is, there's a modern house there that was built in 1964 by the Curtis family, by Abe Curtis. In fact, that road is called Abe Curtis to this day. And the address is 686 Abe Curtis Road. If you type that in, you'll see that. It's the only thing on Abe Curtis Road.
So, how did John Riley, ended up in Kaufman County.
Kaufman County, Texas.
Kaufman County, Texas. And then how did how did Leonard L. end up in Abilene?
Okay, that's a good question. After John Riley died, Minerva married a guy named James Alphin. And my understanding is that Alphin was not very nice to the boys. And the boys would have been Leonard L, Arick, and Claude.
Did she continue to have children?
No, she didn't have any more kids. She just had those 4 kids. And the kids moved west. And I've heard the story.
All of them together?
Well, I don't really know that. It's kind of like they gradually migrated, because I found some of them in Parker County, and then they went on to Abilene. What I have heard is that Leonard L. had some sort of respiratory problem, and that he moved west on the advice of his doctor to get, away from East Texas or whatever, and he moved to Abilene. And that's the only connection we have to Abilene, is Leonard L. moved out there. And he moved Minerva out there because Minerva's marriage with Alphin didn't work out, and I think he was a bad seed, and I think that's all Minerva could get. And so Minerva is buried out there in the Abilene Cemetery next to Leonard L., her son. So she's not buried next to John Riley. John Riley is probably buried back in Kaufman County. He died in 1906.
So did Minerva divorce Alphin and move?
Okay, I don't know that they were divorced.
Do you think he moved with her?
No, I don't. I think he stayed. I think they just split up. Yeah. I just think they went in different directions. They stayed married for a while and they split up.
Did she live with her son?
Yes.
And then she died when?
Around 1928. I'd have to look at in the 20s.
And he died when Papa was a boy.
Yeah, Papa, who is Leonard W. Arrick, Leonard William Arrick. Papa was born in 1930, and Leonard L. Arrick, his father, was born in 1890. So Leonard L. Arrick died in 42, so that would have made his son about 12 or so when he died. And
he was 52 years old.
Yeah, he was, and he was in World War I out of Camp Stanley, and so he had VA benefits, and he had some sort of respiratory problem, and he worked at a brick plant, and he was breathing this dust all day long, and he smoked.
Did he get?
And so I don't know if he had some sort of very bad respiratory problem, but it was something bad. He died young, and I think there are documents that he went to the VA hospital during this time. The VA hospital was over here in Dallas. He went over here and he stayed at this hospital for a while or something. I don't really know the story. Probably some of that information could probably be found out, because this happened in the 40s. This wasn't a long time ago. And so, basically Dad, who is Leonard W. Arrick, grew up with a bunch of sisters and without a dad. His dad died when he was just a kid.
So Leonard L., where did he get deployed during World War I?
I don't know all of that, but he ended up in Camp Stanley, which is down.
Did he go to Europe?
No, not to my knowledge that he did. I don't think he did any of that. His when he died, when his wife died, Ellie Mae Thomason, his wife died 6 years later in 48. That stuff went to Viola, the oldest daughter. And by the way, Viola is named after Minerva Viola Harrison, John Riley's wife. So Viola, who lived in Abilene, who married Bunt Smith, who's Francis Ray Smith, who I'm named after, Francis Ray Smith. I'm named after Ray, his
Roger
middle name.
Ray.
Roger Ray. She got a trunk full of Leonard L's stuff, including possibly his uniform from World War I. And the story I heard was that my dad asked about it, and she said, well, it was stored in the garage, and the garage leaked, and it got wet, and so we threw it away. So this has been a big sort of sore spot in our hearts, that there was a chest full of moldy good stuff. You know, who knows? There could have been pictures and keepsakes. He was Workman of the World. What is that?
Woodmen
of the World. He was a member of that.
Which was like a fraternity.
It was like a fraternity, but it, you know, they did insurance and other stuff. It was
like a pyramid scheme.
Not really back then. I think people had this tribal instinct. It sort of was protective to be part of the Masons or the Woodmen of the World organizations. It was kind of a man group, you know, where the guys got together and they buddied up and swapped favors, and who knows what they did in there. They drank and smoked and played cards. Who knows? But it was a normal group that people had back in that era, and so some of that memorabilia was probably in there. I think the Woodmen were there probably at his funeral and did their little ritual stuff.
Does he have a Woodman grave?
No, he doesn't.
Okay. Well, I remember one time we went out to a cemetery, and you were just looking at the Woodman graves, and I had no idea what they were, but they're basically shaped like trees, right?
Yeah.
So he died. He was working at the Abilene brick plant.
Right. This was during this was after the Depression. It was a bad time. And when the Depression came around, it threw everybody out of work, even the brick plant. But they lived at the brick plant, and the owner of the brick plant let them all live there, even though they weren't making any money during a short period of time, or I don't know how long it was. But Dad grew up at the brick plant, and this is north of Abilene.
Did they have a car?
Not to my knowledge. I don't know that they ever had a car. I don't know that Leonard L ever had a car.
How did he get to Dallas? Train?
A good question. You know, back then, not everyone had a car. You hitchhiked, and, you know, someone would take you to town. It would take you a day or two to get from one town to another. There was railroad back then. I don't know that, you know, that was used a lot, but somehow it might have taken him a whole month to get from Abilene to Dallas, for all I know. There wasn't Interstate 20 back then, but there were roads you could get to Fort Worth.
Yeah.
And there were trails, and some of them were just dirt roads. And this was 1940 something, you know, this was World War II almost era. It was the Dust Bowl era. There was some cataclysmic stuff going on back then. They probably thought it was the end of the world as they know it.
Yeah.
Hitler was...
So Papa grew up with the Dust Bowl. Did he remember the Dust Bowl?
He never told me anything about it. It was just, they lived in Abilene, it was dusty, you know. It was dirt. Papa, who is William W., he was fascinated with Hollywood. He went to all the movies. And, you know, he followed all the movie stars, and that was a big thing for him, I think, in that era.
In the 30s and 40s. And then he didn't have a bicycle. He writes in his biography that he didn't have a bicycle.
Okay, I didn't know that.
He said all of his boys had bicycles. He got all of you guys bicycles, but he never owned one himself.
Oh, really?
And there was one boy in town who had one, and he'd race down in front of all the other kids, and Papa they'd feel so jealous, and he wouldn't let anyone else ride on his bicycle, this kid. He just wanted to show off.
Now, a story that I heard was that when Dad was a little kid, 2 years old or whatever, he quit walking. And they thought he might have had polio. And that his father, Leonard L, Arick, got him a tricycle or something that helped him rebuild his legs, and he got to walk again. And I don't know how long that time took, but I've always wondered. Dad had some really weird health problems that were mostly artery related, and he struggled with artery disease from the age of 50 up. He was having surgery starting at the age of 50. His arteries were clogged. And I always thought, maybe it was smoking or something like that, but he really did have some weird artery inflammation or something. There was something going on with Dad. Now, I know that Dad flew a helicopter through or near a nuclear blast during Operation Plumbbob, during one of the blasts, which was called Smoky. I believe this was in Arizona, maybe around 1953.
It was Nevada.
Nevada.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was one of a series of nuclear explosions. They flew the helicopters across the country in formation.
Okay.
And then they went.
I know that Dad was near the nuclear blast because he was, given instructions to face away and put his eyes into his forearm, and he could see the bones of his arm. The blast was so bright he could see the bones in his arm, and he was looking away from it.
With his eyes closed.
With his eyes closed. It was with his face buried in his arm. He could see, and he was to get into helicopters, and he was to fly, maybe not through the blast, but near it.
With radiation detectors.
And he had a badge, a radiation detector badge. And after they got off the helicopters, they took all the radiation badges. Yep. And so they never got that information.
But all that's declassified now. So I transcribed his biography last year. Or I haven't finished it. It's
okay.
like I'm 90% done. So you can put it on your website when I'm done typing it up. But he even writes a whole thing about how he doesn't think it affected his health. But I looked at the declassified documents, and they're very scientific. It's like research papers for the government to reference. And most of it is outlining the blast, but there's a lot on the radiation readings that they did. So I think maybe what they were doing is just seeing how much radiation would a person get if they had to fly through and do recon.
This was Cold War time. This was right after the first nuke blast in 45, and we didn't know how troops were going to survive, how they were going to survive during nuclear war. And they needed to know, can our helicopters fly in nuclear war? Can our troops fly near nuclear blasts in nuclear war? They were learning all this stuff, and Dad was one of these helicopter flyers in that era that he flew in that, and he was sort of a guinea pig. What I heard from Dad was that his research indicated that they concluded that there was no health problems with this. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. All I know is Dad had some really weird health problems, really bad health problems early on. At the age of 50, he had cranial surgery because his carotid arteries were blocked, and he was having vision problems, and that was at the age of 50.
So,
he
they
died
opened up his skull?
Up here.
Wow.
Yeah, and when I was dating Margot, we went and saw him in the hospital, and he was wearing a cap, and he had just had cranial surgery.
I had no idea.
Yeah, and so he died at the age of 69, and he died of an aneurysm. He had a vessel damage.
So his biography that he wrote himself, do you remember what age he was writing this? Do you remember him sitting down at the typewriter? It's about 30 pages.
I really don't, but in 1977 or 6, I saved up my money from my very first job at Malden's machine shop, making $2.50 an hour, and I bought, my first purchase was a $200 typewriter, an electric typewriter.
How many weeks did that take to save up?
Oh, it probably was all summer.
Yeah.
And my goal was to turn that typewriter into a computer printer. I wanted to use it as a printer for my computer. I was going to put solenoids on each of the buttons and activate them with my computer, because that was the cheaper way to get a printer.
Did they sell
but anyway,
kits that...
Dad ended up buying this typewriter, and he typed It's a typewriter that I got back from him, and I have it in my attic. It's like a Smith Corona. It's baby blue. It's beautiful. I love that thing. But I learned to type on it.
Okay, I have to go see this.
So he typed at least some of that stuff, but he might have typed that particular one, in the 60s in Alaska, for all I know.
No, it was way later.
Was it?
He was talking about all the boys.
Okay.
All of the.
Well,
he did it in the latter years of his life.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
So
I think it was around the time that he was putting together those notebooks.
Okay.
Those
so that would have
binders.
probably been the 80s?
It's got to be later.
Even later?
Yeah, I think he did it in the last 10 years of his life.
Okay.
But
Well,
I don't think he finished.
He did that with my typewriter that I paid for, and I think he bought it from me. Dad was a fair guy. He would have paid me money for it.
It ends abruptly. Not abruptly. It ends describing what's going on, like around the earthquake, I think. I don't think he really goes into his life post-earthquake or post-helicopter crash.
Okay, well, that would have been 62 or 3. The earthquake was 64.
When was the helicopter crash?
Well, it would have been right around 63 or so, just right before the earthquake.
I don't think he really went past that.
Okay, well, then that wasn't my typewriter. Because my typewriter wasn't bought till the late 70s.
No. He just stopped. I think he was working on a larger project.
Oh, okay.
But he wrote about Darren. He mentions Darren.
Oh, okay.
He mentions a lot.
Yeah.
I bought all my boys' bicycles, Mm-hmm. He mentions all that. He has some reflection. It's rare. It's mostly facts, but he has the occasional reflection of, I regretted this or this happened. We did an hour. Are you okay?
I'm okay.
Okay, so I want to kind of map out what Papa was doing in the 60s. So we'll do your biography in another recording. But I want to do Papa's later life.
Okay.
So in the 60s, 70s, 80s, we'll just start with the 60s.
So I was born in 61. We were in Alaska. Dad was in the Army. He was training helicopters, I guess. And he had a helicopter crash. He was flying these dual rotor blades, the cargo ones, the Sikorskys, I guess, that have the synchronized rotors. Mm-hmm. But anyway, he had an engine failure. And he was taught to, okay, if you have an engine failure, if you have a choice, flare the ship into the trees and let the trees kind of spring you, cushion your flow, kind of go into the trees of the side and kind of bend them over. So he did that. He said, but the trees were frozen and they just snapped. And they just went straight down. He was carrying like a general or something. He was carrying a crew, some important people. And he crashed. And I don't know all the story. You can probably read it. I mean, he's got some, mm-hmm. There's a newspaper clipping and some stuff.
Yeah, that's in there.
But the short story I heard was that he walked to the base and, said, my leg hurts. And they said, well, you got a crushed ankle. So they casted him up. He was casted all the way up here. And, I was too young to know all this, but that's what happened that was in Alaska. But then in 64 April, which was the Good Friday earthquake, the gigantic earthquake, it's on Wikipedia, it's huge. The earthquake hit. We were living on the base on Beluga Street, which has been recently bulldozed and new barracks and stuff. But it was kind of like in a big apartment complex, and it had a basement.
This was in Anchorage.
This was, right, near, it was Fort, why don't I know that? Fort Richardson? It's near, I was born in Elmendorf Air Force Base, which was right down the street, but you can look that up. And I wish I knew some of that stuff. Some of this stuff I used to know, but I don't know now. So the earthquake hit, and I guess Mom decided to bring us all back home. We kind of evacuated, but Dad stayed. And the story is that Dad took us to the airplane, and we got on an airplane, me, Dennis, and Randy, and Mom. And once I looked outside the window, I saw Dad down there waving at us I started screaming. And I was 2 years old. And I started screaming, and the airline went all the way back to, I can't remember if we went to Washington State first and then to LA, or we went straight to LA. But they said I screamed nonstop the entire flight without stop. And it was hours. And that everyone on the plane was trying to console me, but my problem was we were leaving and Dad was there, and that was wrong. Something was not going to work. And so as soon as I saw that, oops, Dad is not with us. So, of course, I don't remember this, but so I think we went to LA airport, because I remember horror stories of they had to walk under these long corridors carrying all this luggage. And let's see, Randy and Dennis. Randy would have been about 12 years old, and Dennis would have been, I don't know, 8 years old or something. And Mom carrying me, screaming. And she's all alone, Dad's left up in Alaska running supply missions to recover from the earthquake. And so anyway, they came back to Fort Worth, and we stayed with Jeanette and Malden. Jeanette is Mom's sister, and Malden, her husband. And we lived there for a while, but eventually Dad came back here, and the story I heard was that he was going to re-up for the military, but Mom said, absolutely not, I'm going to leave you if you do, because I'm not going to do this Army life. And so somehow he landed a job at Bell Helicopter, which was tremendous. And I think it was Randy that told me that if that hadn't happened, Dad might have ended up at Vietnam, and that wouldn't have been a good outcome, because a lot of helicopter pilots were killed in Vietnam. And some of his Army buddies, like Paul Smith, did stay with the Army and did go to Vietnam and fly helicopters in Vietnam and survived. And I don't know if some probably didn't. But Dad landed a job.
And he kept in touch with those guys?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Paul Smith, and we went and visited them in San Antonio and Mineral Wells, and they moved all the time, like our Army family does. But they were friends with us up in Alaska, and so the Smith family, Paul and Angie Smith, and they had 2 sons, Donnie, and I can't remember the other one. But they're around on Facebook now, and I know them. So Dad landed a great job at Bell Helicopter as an experimental test pilot, which was sort of a guinea pig job. But he bought a house there on Corona Street in Richland Hills in 1964, and that house had stayed vacant. And when we got there, the grass was all the way up to the eave of the house. And I remember playing in the living room when there was no furniture and stuff. But it was a nice house.
Was it a new build?
It was a new build, new neighborhood. Loop 820 wasn't even there yet. You could see all the way to Oklahoma.
Really?
Yeah.
I mean, the highway went up right next to it.
Yeah.
1 block over.
But the Loop 820 wasn't there.
So what year did he start working at Bell Helicopter? Was it
64.
Oh, so he only stayed in Alaska for a little bit.
Yeah, it was just a few months, I guess.
And did Mama work?
Well, she was, I can't remember her, she, of course, kept house and kept us boys, and we were a handful, and she bowled. I don't remember that she had like a job, but she did some work. I think she sold Mary Kay for a while when I was a little kid. Darren came around unexpectedly when she was 39, and that changed some plans. And but she did later in life where she worked at a florist and did some other stuff. But I don't know of any jobs that she had in the 60s and 70s. She was, I didn't go to daycare, which was a big, huge, great thing in life. I walked to school and I walked home, and Mom was there. And it was a good life having a mom there. Unlike a lot of kids who had to ride the bus, and they rode the bus to daycare, and their parents picked them up at 6. And I didn't have that kind of life. I came home to a house and a color television with Batman playing.
So Papa was working at Bell Helicopter. You're very young at this point.
Yeah, my third, for some reason, I remember my third birthday, which was October of 1964. I remember this birthday. I can even tell you some of the presents I got. I got Crazy Foam, which was a product from the 60s. You can look it up. You spray it. It's like a shaving cream, and you can make, you can spray it in the shower and make. But anyway, for some reason, I remember that birthday. I don't remember my 4th birthday or my 5th birthday or my 6th birthday, but I remember my 3rd birthday. I think it was, there was a lot of trauma during that time. There was a big move and earthquake and all this stuff, and I was kind of whacked out as a little kid. But I remember my 3rd birthday, and it was in that house.
So Papa was working. Did you, was Papa affected by any of the cultural shift of the 60s? I know Randy was a little bit.
I just think he thought the whole thing was stupid. What is this crap? And golly, it must have been really terrible because, music was new, drugs were new, things like LSD were still legal. And, we didn't know, Woodstock in 69. Then there was the Vietnam War, and Randy was going to get drafted for the Vietnam. It was a terrible time. And I was, 8, 9 years old, 10 years old. And Darren came along. That was, something that wasn't completely planned. But Randy went into the Coast Guard, and Randy had some problems in the Coast Guard. He ended up in a hospital in San Antonio. Went and visited him. I was like 9 years old, and I remember having chiggers real bad from an Abilene visit and could barely walk. And anyway, it's amazing weird things we remember. But that was a troubling time.
What was Papa doing in the 70s, just as a decade?
He worked as an experimental test pilot. And
so he stayed, he went to the Army, and then he went to Bell.
Yeah.
And that was his whole career.
That was a goal, was to, have a stable thing that you stayed at all your life and retired from. That was the goal back then. Now we live in the gig economy where you don't care, but back then the goal was to have an education and a job. Now, he didn't have a degree. He had only a partial degree. And in Bell, he was passed up for a lot of promotions because he didn't have a degree. And Bell was a big company, and they just looked at degrees. And so finally, in the 80s, Dad went and finished his degree. He had to go to Dallas Baptist University to get his credits transferred, and he got his degree. And he switched at Bell from being experimental test pilot to be an FAA coordinator. And so, he ended up doing very well, but I think he felt like he got gypped for the first 20 years or however long it was. He was in a pretty dangerous job. Some of his friends were killed out there at Bell. Lots of... he's got a picture of one helicopter. They said, okay, get in this helicopter and fly down this direction, and when you get to this point, push this button. So he did, and the button was for these new guns, these Gatling guns that are on the side of the helicopter. And they went off, and the vibration jarred the doors open. And the ammunition the doors routed the ammunition into his cockpit, and it shot up his entire cockpit right in front of him. And he landed successfully somehow.
Wait. So the gun was mounted on the side of the... No, the gun was inside the helicopter.
No, it was on the outside of the helicopter.
And so it started shooting inside?
Yeah, it shot his cockpit, blew his cockpit up.
So it could have easily shot him.
Well, yeah, of course. I was right next to him. And these are we're not talking 22 calibers, okay? We're talking about these bullets that are the size of your big toe. They could, kill an elk at 2,000 yards or whatever. But anyway, he's got a picture in one of his albums of this blown up dashboard of this helicopter that's just blasted to hell from all these bullets that came through the cockpit. But another story I heard was one of his buddies, who was also an experimental test pilot, was he went out and he got in a helicopter and he was testing it, and the main rotor blade failed and swooshed through and chopped the cockpit in half. The rotor blade
so
went,
it like flipped around and
it went. For some reason the rotor blade dipped and went through the cockpit where the. Okay.
Oh, so it dipped forward.
It dipped forward and cut the cockpit off, and all the guys ran out there, and they ran to the guy, and he's sitting in the chair, and they said, "Are you okay?" And he says, "Yeah, I'm fine. There's no scratch on me." And they unbuckle him, and he gets out, and they start walking back to the hangar. And he goes, "I can't believe it. I'm fine. I can't believe I survived this." And he falls to the ground. And they rush him to the hospital, and there's not a scratch on him. And he goes into a coma. And he was in a coma for the rest of his life. He was in a coma, and he lived a normal life. But he was in a coma for the rest of that life. And I don't know, that might have been like 50 years or something. And his wife ended up remarrying. You know, he had a wife and kids and everything. But he was in a coma in the hospital until he died. And he was, a fairly young man. I think he was probably in his 30s. I don't remember who that was. Randy could probably tell you who that was. But I don't know if he wrote about that in any of his...
Did the blade just slice him in half and then he just resealed?
He might have had an internal injury of some sort, or maybe it was actually an emotional thing. I don't know, but that was one of the scary stories that I remember.
And then Papa made more money as a clerk than he did, or doing paperwork. As
well, he did. I think he made a lot more money being FAA coordinator with a degree, like by a long shot, like 3 times as much. Because I don't think
risking his life.
I don't think being an experimental test pilot paid very much money. I think around 1980 he was making somewhere around $30,000 a year,
which nowadays would be
maybe 50. I don't know, maybe more than that.
What year was this?
See, in the late 70s, I think was making about $30K a year. So it was enough back then.
It'd be like 60 now.
Yeah, it was enough back then to buy a house and to raise kids, but it wasn't enough to do anything more than that. But back then, the dentist lived right next to the truck driver in the same kind of house. There wasn't $2 million homes and $50,000 homes. There was all just $60,000 homes. Well, in 1964, that house cost them $16,000.
And they got how long was the mortgage on it?
It was to my knowledge, it was a 30-year mortgage.
Wow. What was the interest rate?
In the 60s, it probably wasn't too bad. I don't know, 5, 6, 7%. But, in the 70s, the interest rates were 13 to 18% for just a regular loan. In fact, my car in 1977, my Mustang, I think it was a 14% interest rate. That was pretty typical of the time. We had bad inflation, and we had high interest rates. This was the Carter administration. Mm-hmm. At the peak, interest rates were 18, 19%. It was terrible. And, you'd go to the grocery store and everything was 2% higher every month. So there were some times where there were double-digit inflation for a couple of years. And in the middle of that, in the 70s, there was the oil embargo, and that freaked some people out too. I mean, I remember standing in line to get my car refueled, not knowing if I was going to run out of gas while I was in line. And if I did, what would I do? I guess push my car off the side of the road and not be able to make it home. That was 1979. There were gas lines in 79.
Did you vote that election? The 80 election, 1980?
Yeah, I voted for Reagan.
And that was your first vote?
Yeah. And I felt sorry for Jimmy Carter. I thought he was a good person, but he just seemed weak, and I thought his reasoning was flawed. And to this day, even stuff he said last week, I think the exact same thing. He is weak and his reasoning is flawed. But gosh, he just seems like such a nice guy. But I realized, I was a young adult and I was thinking, we got to be stronger than this. We can't, I feel bad for him, but I can't elect a president because I feel like he's a nice guy. There's got to be something more to it. So I voted for Reagan, and I remember Reagan's tax cut. I remember getting my check thinking, wow, I got $20 more in my paycheck. This is the first time I've ever done something, that a politician has ever done something that I've actually seen the effects of. It actually trickled down to me. And I actually had an increase in my paycheck.
It literally did trickle down to you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, my first experience with learning about politics and stuff was in the Reagan era in the 80s. And I thought that was just normal to have a Reagan. I thought Reagan was just kind of a normal kind of politician that just happened regularly. But I realized later, after going through Clinton and everybody else, that Reagan was special. He was unique.
All right, let's end it there.
Okay, 120.
120.